Welcome to the Litigation War Room, where you will hear great stories and great insights to raise your litigation game and win more cases. Here's your host, litigation attorney, Maxwell Goss.
Justin Brooks, welcome to the Litigation War Room.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here.
Well, it's really a pleasure to have you, Justin. You are a law professor at University of San Diego. You are director of the California Innocence Project. You're the author of a wonderful book that we'll be talking about today. You Might Go to Prison, Even Though You're Innocent. You were featured in Brian Banks, a movie centering on your work and the difference you made in one life. And you're many more things too. So really excited to have you on today.
Thanks so much. I've actually stepped down as director of the California Innocence Project, but I'm still the founder and I directed it for the past 24 years. There's a new innocence organization in San Diego that I'm on the board of called the Innocence Center. I'm still involved in that. And then I'm spending most of my time now working in Latin America, developing innocence projects and helping get people out of prison down there.
Yeah, you were telling me a bit about that when we talked before the interview, and I guess that's as good of a place as any to start. That sounded really exciting and important. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing in Latin America?
Sure. So there's a couple of things. For many years, I've assisted in developing innocence organizations in Latin America. We now have 35 from Chile to Argentina to Ecuador, Colombia, Central America, the Caribbean. And every year for the past decade, I've hosted conferences down there to train lawyers how to do this kind of work of getting innocent people out of prison. And we freed, I think we're 37 innocent people down there.
Wow.
Yeah. And some of them have been very high profile cases that have had a ton of media attention and have really assisted in getting people to see the problems in their systems. And the other thing I spend a lot of time down there doing is training lawyers how to do trials. Because Mexico, for example, has adopted a trial system for the first time in 400 years. And it's part of the Constitution now that you have a right to trial, but most lawyers don't know how to do trials because it's not part of the legal education. So I spend a lot of time in Mexico doing trial training.
Tell me again, how many law schools are there in Mexico?
So there's 200 in the United States. There's more than 2,300 in Mexico. And that's something I always ask people, how many law schools do you think there are in Mexico? People say like 4, 5, 6.
Right.
No, there's a massive number because law is an undergraduate degree. There is no bar exam and there's barely no kind of certification for law schools. And so you just have these hundreds of thousands of students who come out, they print up a business card and they're lawyers. So it's a big challenge down there to get to started. A lot of them are free. The law schools are free. I mean, education in general is pretty much free in Latin America. It's a whole different system than we have in the United States. And there's some strong arguments for what they do in some countries. You know, you look at universities like University of Buenos Aires, where I spent a lot of time in Argentina, and people get an excellent education there at a very low cost because basically all the faculty are adjuncts. And they don't really have this sort of very expensive professor model of tenured professors and all of that. And they don't spend enormous funds on facilities like we've seen in the US education, where they put swimming pools and dorms and have built these like fantastic campuses, but students come out with huge debt as well. So there's a real trade-off for our education system in the US, the way we're doing it.
Well, I think the work you're doing in Latin America could probably warrant a whole episode into itself. Maybe we can have you back another time to talk about that.
Sure.
I do want to talk to you about your book. Before we get to that, though, I have to ask, tell us about Brian Banks.
So Brian Banks was one of the best high school football players in the country. He went to the best sports high school in the United States that's put out more Major League Baseball players, NBA players, NFL players, which is Long Beach Poly. Also put out Snoop Dogg and Cameron Diaz. So it's a very famous school for sports. And he was an athlete that shined there and had national attention. He was on his way to USC on a full scholarship. Everyone said he was going to the pros. And then one day, a 15-year-old classmate, Brian was 16 at the time, accused him of rape. And there was no investigation in this case. It went to trial. His lawyer told him if he pled out, she might be able to get him probation. But if he doesn't plead, he's looking at 44 years to life in prison. So here you have a kid on the day of his trial, sitting in a room where a lawyer's saying, look, we go to that courtroom, it's likely you're going to die in prison. If I go in there and enter a plea, I might be able to get you home today and get back in football, get you back on track. He's crying. He says, can I talk to my parents? They say, no, it's your decision. You got to make it right now. And just imagine being in that position yourself and for a kid to be put in that position. So of course he pleads out. He doesn't get probation. He gets 6 years in prison. And then years later, the young girl who'd accused him of rape, Facebook friend requests him and says, can we let bygones be bygones? I'm sorry for making up that you raped me in high school. And that kind of started the whole story for me of going through the odyssey of getting Brian exonerated, ultimately traveling around the country with him, going to NFL tryouts, which was maybe the most unique experience of my career, sitting up late at night with him, looking at depth charts for linebackers and reading through playbooks, and ultimately played for the Atlanta Falcons for a short period of time, but ended up making it to be able to play in the NFL, which was his dream. And so there was a movie made about it called Brian Banks. That's now on Hulu in the United States and on Netflix in the rest of the world. And it's an important story because our system has become mostly plea bargains, not trials. And people don't realize that 90% of people plead out. And of course, most of them are guilty. I'm not naive enough to say that's not true, but some of them are innocent and just not willing to take the risk of heading into the casino we call a trial court and hope that there's a good outcome. So that's really what it's all about.
Wow, that's incredible. Now, I promise not to fill this interview with bubblegum questions, but I do have to ask, what was it like to see yourself portrayed on the big screen by Greg Kinnear?
Absolutely surreal.
I'm sure.
First of all, Greg Kinnear was at my law school, following me around, going to my classes. I had colleagues testing me saying, did I just see Greg Kinnear walking with you in the law school? So he really put his heart into it. He's a fantastic guy. I mean, everything they say about him in Hollywood is true. Just one of those real mentions of a guy. And then I remember vividly sitting in the editing room, in the editing theater, watching it on a giant screen for the first time. And there he is in my car, wearing my clothes in my office. I mean, they really went after the detail of it down to, what watch I was wearing and sneakers. And it's a surreal experience to have somebody portray you in a movie.
Yeah, I can only imagine. Well, that's really cool. Well, the main thing I want to talk to you today about is your book. You might go to prison, even though you're innocent. What prompted you to write this book?
Yeah, so I talked to a publisher about the idea of me writing a book reflecting on the 3 decades I've done innocence work. And what I really started thinking about was that when I started doing this work, I get in arguments with people about whether there are innocent people in prison. And that argument has gone away. We've now documented like 3,400 cases of wrongful conviction in just the United States. And so what I wanted to do is kind of look back at my cases and a lot of the studies and statistics and categorize the why. Why do innocent people go to prison? Because that's where we're at now. We know they're in there. We know why, we can document the cases. So now it's kind of, what are we going to do about it? First title of the book was Top 10 Reasons You Might Go to Prison If You're Innocent. The publisher thought that was a little clickbaity, so we dropped the top 10. But I still structured the book around that as the 10 reasons I've seen. And so, for example, I've had a ton of cases based on misidentification. And we now know all the problems with cross-racial identification. We know the problems when there's a gun involved in a case, how it affects identifications. We know the problems with suggestibility when police officers are in the room who know who a suspect is during a lineup. So we now can identify all these problems, and now it's time to start doing something about it. So with each chapter of the book, I talk about my own cases, I identify these problems, and I talk about the reforms that can be done in the criminal legal system to decrease the number of wrongful convictions, which is the ultimate goal.
I'd like to dwell on that title for a minute. I mean, there are a lot of things you could have called the book. You could have just said, profiles in innocence or something bland like that. But your title is in the second person and it speaks directly to the self-interest of the reader.
I'm really happy to and glad you picked up on that. It's exactly what I wanted to do. You might go to prison even though you're innocent, because the problem is people don't really care often about issues until they directly affect them or they might affect them. And I've seen it over and over again where people in the jail telling me, I never thought this would happen to me. I never thought this would happen to a family member of mine. And that's why I wanted to put it right in their face. And in fact, I talk about in the book that I even myself can't set aside the notion that I might end up in prison. So I literally have a plan for my first day in prison.
You know better than anyone.
Yeah, got a plan. Day one in prison.
Yeah.
I go out to the yard. I find all the shot callers for each one of the gangs. I gather them together and I say, I'm going to be your lawyer, your lawyer, your lawyer, your lawyer. Keep all these other dudes away from me. I will be every day in the law library trying to get you guys out of here. It could happen. It could happen to you and it could happen to me. I can't be in denial about that.
Well, and that really is one of the things that I took away from your book. I really love the book. It is moving, well written. It is blessedly short. I'm certainly a reader, but a nice slim volume certainly makes one more inclined to pick it up. And in addition to, your heart just goes out to these people whose stories you tell, but you are left with this unsettling feeling of there is this sort of randomness to the justice system, and anybody could be caught up in it. I think you compared it to a casino of a justice system earlier, and that is certainly one of the things that I took away from your book.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted it to be very readable. I'm a law professor, and I've spent my whole career writing law review articles, and I did not want it to be that. I wanted it to be something that anybody could pick up, anybody could understand this problem, because my goal is to have better jurors and better voters. I want to lay out in simple terms the problem with our criminal justice policies, because as voters, we've been suckers over and over again to these very poorly thought out 3-word slogan policies of, lock them up and more police, more prisons. And as taxpayers, we've suffered from it. And as citizens in a community, we've suffered because we not only have the largest prison system in the world, we incarcerate the highest percentage of our population in the world, and we have one of the highest recidivism rates in the world, which means we're doing things wrong. And yet I'm still hearing in this, again, upcoming election cycle, the same tired rhetoric that has failed time and time again of be tough on crime, build more prisons, put more police on the streets. And it just hasn't worked.
Yeah, what's that cliche about the definition of insanity?
Exactly. You keep trying the same thing over and over again, thinking it's not going to fail, and it does every time. And that's what we've done. And I think most Americans don't even realize that we lock up more of our population than any country in the world. And if you think about that for a second, there's a direct connection between poverty and crime. No one can deny that. And yet the richest country in the world locks up more of its population than any other country. It should be the opposite of that. It should be the poorest country in the world is locking up the highest percentage of their population. But that's just not true in the United States because we have so many failed policies. We have such long sentences. We've made mistake after mistake after mistake in the criminal legal system.
Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about how you got to where you are. Your story as being really involved in these innocence cases starts at Michigan State University.
I was actually a professor at what is now Western State University, which was known then as Cooley Law School. So I was a very young law professor. I just moved to Michigan from Washington, D.C., where I practiced as a criminal defense attorney. And I was teaching first-year criminal law. And I read in the newspaper about a young woman in Chicago who was sentenced to death on a plea bargain. And I thought, that can't be right. Nobody gets sentenced to death on a plea bargain. But in fact, it was true. I researched the case and she'd been sentenced to death on a plea bargain. So I met with her on death row. I drove all the way out to Illinois and out into the farmlands where they kept the women in a place called Dwight that's now closed down. And I find this 23-year-old kid, this young Puerto Rican woman who says, my lawyer told me to plead out and I'm innocent. And I was like, you're innocent and you pled out? You got the death penalty? And she said, yeah. So I went back to Cooley Law School and my first year criminal law students. And I said, here's the story. There's this woman who says she's innocent on death row. Who wants to help me out? She can investigate in this case. 4 kids raised their hands. And we sat around the kitchen table and started going through the police reports. And then I put them all in my Jeep that Saturday. And we went to Humboldt Park in Chicago and realized that the only eyewitness was lying because it was impossible to see what she said she saw when we her apartment. It was a shocking case. The lack of due process just shocked me and caused me to change the whole direction of my life.
How does it come about that someone gets the death penalty on a plea?
So she'd been assigned a really great public defender. And this is what I talk about in chapter 1 of my book, like that people don't understand much about criminal lawyers. They don't understand the difference between a public defender, a court-appointed lawyer, a private lawyer, contract lawyers. There's all these different systems, even within one state. In fact, I remember when I practiced in Michigan, if I took a case in Ann Arbor, I got paid for every hour I worked. If I picked up a case in Lansing, I got paid a flat fee. Well, when you get a flat fee per case in one jurisdiction and you get paid by the hour in another jurisdiction, think about the pressure that's on you to go to trial or not go to trial, right? So if it was in Ann Arbor and I went to trial, I'd get paid for all my trial hours. Might be a 2-3 week trial. If it's in East Lansing, it didn't matter. I was going to get $1,200 whether I went to trial or not. And so people don't understand these kinds of pressures and how it really works. And in her case, she had a great public defender, a woman who'd done hundreds of felony trials. And her friends thought, nope, you want a private lawyer. So they fire this really competent public defender and then hire a guy who has a little office in the neighborhood and give him a $10,000 retainer. He doesn't do any investigation and just pleads her straight up to double homicide. And then on top of it, of getting a terrible lawyer, she's got a terrible judge who was a former homicide detective who went to school at night and had been certified as unqualified by the bar. And he just accepted it. And they went to sentencing. She got sentenced to death. So she had no investigation in her case, no due process, no witnesses, nothing. And she ended up on death row. And even as a criminal defense attorney, I was shocked that that could happen in the United States of America, that a kid could get pushed through the system like that without any due process at all.
Yeah. Now this woman's name is Marilyn Malero.
Yes.
And can you tell us the result? My reading was you got a good result for her, but it was also maybe a bit bittersweet.
Well, finally, so her death sentence was reversed by the Illinois Supreme Court. Very competent lawyers from the appellate defender's office argued that. And when it was reversed, it went back to the trial court for resentencing. I did her resentencing along with some public defenders in front of a new jury. They, though, only had the choice of a life sentence or death sentence because they wouldn't allow the plea to be withdrawn. So it's either death case or life sentence. Fortunately, the jury resentenced her to life, but now she's got a life sentence. So I was so inspired by the case that I quit my job, moved from Michigan to California and launched the California Innocence Project because California, had the biggest prison population in the United States. It had the biggest death row in the world. And this was the place to launch the project. But I kept litigating Marilyn's case. And it's kind of sad that, over the years, I've walked 40 innocent people out of prison, but they were never Marilyn, my first case. And I litigated her case through state court, through federal court. I petitioned the United States Supreme Court. I went to the United Nations and filed a petition against the city of Chicago for human rights violations, which they still haven't ruled on. I did four separate clemency petitions in front of 4 separate governors. And finally, after 27 years of litigation, I was able to get her out on clemency and then filed a habeas petition and got her fully exonerated. So I finished the case like a year ago. I started the case when I was 29 years old and I finished it at, 58.
Wow.
It was a long time. In fact, I'm going to see her tomorrow. I just talked to her today. We're both heading to New Orleans because once a year, all the exonerees from around the country and lawyers that do this work, we get together somewhere. So I'm going to meet up with her down in New Orleans.
Oh, that's really great. Well, I'm sure it's a small, tight community who have something important in common that not a lot of people can understand.
Yeah, it definitely is.
Well, how did this set your career in motion? I mean, you already had a career, but your involvement in the Innocence Project.
I mean, it changed everything for me. I quit a very comfortable job where all I had to do is teach a couple of classes on criminal law a week and write some articles. and live a nice life in East Lansing and go to Michigan State football, Michigan State basketball, and everything else that's going on out there, to running a nonprofit that I had to raise money for and hire staff. And it was a lot of work. It took years really to build up my project to the point of I had 10 full-time staff attorneys, 100 volunteer attorneys, giant group of law students, and we're doing cases all over California. So I went from just a law professor to director of a fairly large nonprofit. So yeah, really changed everything for me. But it's been hard work, but I'm lucky I found something I was extremely passionate about and took the plunge to do that. And that's something I tell my students all the time. You got to find what you're passionate about, and then it won't feel like work. And it certainly will feel like work if you're not passionate about it.
So you never looked back. I can only imagine how emotionally draining it must be.
Yeah, that is the hard part of it. I realized a year ago, before I stepped down as director of the California Innocence Project, I went to our annual conference, and there were 1,200 people there. And when I started this work, there were about 6 of us in the world doing it. And there's this huge group of young people and energy. And I realized I was the last one of the original directors that I started doing this work with who was left as a director. A quarter century of doing these kinds of cases, dealing with the families, dealing with the clients, spending time in prison, at crime scenes. There's clearly secondary trauma that you suffer. I actually started becoming aware that it was getting more and more difficult for me to hear the case presentations that we had twice a week, where cases would be presented in front of me. I would have the awful Caesar-like power of thumbs up or thumbs down, whether we proceeded in the case. And just hearing story after story after story of cases where I knew we could do nothing. And that's the hard thing. I mean, people see the victories, they're amazing, but I was every day for the last 25 years hearing about, the typical case. A bunch of kids in a car in LA, one kid pulls a gun out, shoots someone. Everybody goes down for conspiracy to murder and accessory. I know when I hear that case that it is likely that a lot of those kids are innocent and they didn't know this guy was going to pull a gun, or they didn't think they were going to pull the trigger. But if a jury rejected that defense, there's nothing I can do about it. The same thing. I've never won a single drug case in the United States. I won one in Nicaragua, where my client got charged with drugs and he didn't have any drugs. Problem in the United States is there's only 2 things you need to prove for drug possession. And it's that you had drugs and you knew you had drugs. But I also know that because our possession laws don't require you to actually have it on your person, there are cases where a car gets pulled over, cocaine is found in the car, everybody in the car can be charged with possession. And if a jury didn't believe that you didn't know it was in that bag or in that glove compartment box, there's nothing I can do about that case. So there's a certain sense of helplessness, even though I've been very empowered by walking 40 people out of prison and I feel like I'm a competent lawyer. There's a certain sense of helplessness that ultimately can start seeping into your psyche of, I can't do anything for so many people. And that's draining without it. That's the hardest part of it.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I would like to talk about some of the people that you have managed to help. You tell so many wonderful stories in your book. I thought maybe we'd just dwell on a couple of them and then maybe draw a few kind of lessons learned at the end here. But I kind of picked a couple that piqued my interest. One was Rafael Madrigal. Can you tell us a little bit about his story, what his background was, and how you got involved in the case?
Yeah, definitely. So Rafael had the best alibi I'd ever seen. He was working on the line in a factory when a shooting happens 30 miles away. There's no physical evidence connecting him. There's no motive connecting him. There's nothing that connects him to this crime except an identification done by a white woman, and Rafael's Latino, of a photo taken when he's a teenager and he's nearly 30 at the time of the crime. And that's it. It was just a simple photo identification. And whenever people tell me you can't be convicted on identification alone, I say, you are wrong. And I tell them the story of Rafael Madrigal, because even with that incredible alibi, which unfortunately his lawyer didn't check out, he gets convicted. And we were able to definitively prove that he was at work at the moment of the shooting because he was the only one who knew how to use this piece of laminating equipment. And it was right in the middle of an assembly line. And the owner said if he wasn't at work, the whole assembly line would have shut down because no one else knew how to do his job. Then we found his time cards that he punched in out of work. Then we had 10 witnesses that put him there. And then on top of it, we got a hold of a jail phone call from the actual shooter to his girlfriend saying, I don't know who this guy Raphael Madrigal is, but he's going down for the shooting I did. So this was like an incredible case where we wrapped the whole thing up in a bow. We still had to fight pretty hard in court to get him out. And we ultimately were able to free him, but he spent, nearly a decade in prison as a result of that. And his case is a perfect example of the problems with identifications, that identification testimony is not that strong. But when jurors hear someone come into court and say, I'm 100% sure it's that dude, they convict on that. And we now know after study, after study, after study, that first of all, human memory is very fallible, that we're not that good at doing identifications, that the procedures we use are very fallible. And it took us 2 decades to get Los Angeles to change the way they were doing their procedures. And they were doing it in ways that were highly suggestive. And and cross-racial identifications are almost always wrong. And lawyers don't do a good job of educating jurors about that. But the bottom line is how good you're at identifying people not of your own race is based on your experience with that race, particularly in the first 5 years of your life when you develop your facial recognition software. And there's so many studies about this. It has nothing to do with racism. It's purely about exposure. But I've walked, 8 people out of prison who were identifying cross-racial identifications and ultimately proved to be innocent. So I have zero faith in those.
This might be speculative, but how do these terrible policies and ways of doing things get put in place in the first place? Is there pressure on prosecutors and on law enforcement to get a conviction? Is that part of what leads to it?
I think there's pressure throughout the system. It starts with the police, where there's pressure to solve cases, and often their first assumption is wrong, and then they get tunnel vision, and they keep building that case. It's actually interesting. I said to my wife the other day, we were talking about lost civilizations. This is maybe a little off track, but stay with me for a second. And it's sort of like when we look at lost civilizations and there's sometimes technology, we think about like, how did they even do that? And we don't know because the technology was lost. And when you think about technology, it evolves. So, we started, is a Tesla that different than a horse and buggy? We start with the same concept that we'll have 4 wheels and somebody sitting inside of it. And then it's just evolved from that to what we have today. And I think that's the problem with the way cases are often built is you start with an assumption and now you're building from there forward and not keeping your mind open enough to all possibilities. And I've seen that again, over and over again. It's very human. It's what we do as humans. It's the whole basis of the internet, that the internet feeds us over and over again from what we already believe. Right? Because then we'll click on that. Oh, I like that idea. I like that idea. I like that idea. Eventually they know exactly who you are. It'll just keep feeding it to you and you're in a sound chamber. And I think the same things happen with police. If you'd asked me that question 25 years ago, I would have said, police set people up. They're, it's all terrible. But the older I get, the more I just think most people get up every day and try to do their job. Everything's a bell curve, right? There's a few people are extraordinary at what they do. Most of us are good to okay. And then there's the terrible and horrible that are a small number. That small number can do a lot of damage. But I think mostly it's negligence or laziness or tunnel vision, or they just want to get home and watch Survivor.
Right. Institutional pressures also, overwork.
Yeah. It's all that goes into it. And I think once we start talking like that, I think people accept it more because now it's not they're evil, we're good. It's that they're human and we're all human. And let's sit down and figure out what mistakes was made because we're human, we make mistakes. And I've gotten better at talking to prosecutors, at talking to police on these topics because I've gotten to that point of realization and maybe humility about my own life and my own work and knowing none of us are infallible. And there could be mistakes I've made along the way. There could be cases I turned down, I should have taken. There could have been cases I could have done a better job on. I think all this we get a little bit older and a little bit grayer.
Well, that is also well said. Let's talk about one more if you have time. I'd love to talk to you about every chapter of your book, but another one that jumped out at me was the story of this man named Ken Marsh.
Yeah.
Tragic story. They're all tragic stories, but it's terrible. Tell us about him.
Yeah, absolutely tragic. A tragic guy as well, because he went to prison for the death of his girlfriend's baby. And when you go to prison as a baby killer, it's about as low on the totem pole as you can get. And in California, the way prison works is people break off into gangs that they were in and to cities that they came from. And the gangs are along racial lines by and large. Ken had none of that. Ken's like a middle class guy in San Diego. He's partially Native American, partially white. He had victim written all over when he went to prison. And so he was locked down in solitary confinement for most of the time he was inside. And it did real damage to him. Like when I first got him out of prison, I had to hold his hand to cross streets because everything was going so fast. He was scared of car, having constant panic attacks. And what happened was his girlfriend's baby, this toddler, fell off a couch, was reaching basically for a piece of glass, an ashtray on a fireplace mantle, fell over, hit its head on a brick hearth, and died. But when the baby went to the hospital, they thought the bruising was excessive for that kind of fall. And so they treated it as a homicide. And what we were able to prove 2 decades later was the baby had an undiagnosed blood disorder that caused excessive bruising. And that was the whole basis for this prosecution. And the baby's mother for 20 years had said the baby fell off the couch. Ken's innocent. And we finally were able to prove it to the district attorney of San Diego by consent. We walked him out together, which is how these cases should be resolved, is working together. But yeah, he lost 20 years of his life in some of the worst situations I've seen for any of my clients, because there's a huge difference between going to prison and staying on what we call the main line, meaning you can do work, you can do education, you can have visits, you can go out in the yard, and these people are in solitary confinement for protective custody or punishment. And we use, by the way, solitary confinement more than any country in the world. And it's been proven to cause severe psychological damage. And it's, once again, us shooting ourselves in the foot. We want to punish these guys, but then we let them out and we damage them by putting them in that kind of situation. So Ken's case was unique in a lot of ways, but there are so many bad baby death cases out there because doctors are trained in medical school when they see what we call the triad of symptoms, which is basically blood on the brain, swelling of the brain, and blood behind the eyes. Then they see that, they say it's shaken baby and it's definitely abuse. And we now know there's lots of other causes of the triad of symptoms. And in fact, a certain percentage of people are born with the triad of symptoms just from a regular vaginal delivery, because pressure of the delivery can cause that kind of bruising. And because it's subdural, doctors don't see it at birth. They then say, okay, the baby's color is okay, it's breathing okay, send them home. And now if you go home and it all dissipates, you're fine. But if you go home and then fall off the changing table, hit your head, die, now the parents go back to the emergency room with the baby. Now they do a CT scan. Now they do an X-ray, and now they find injuries that actually happened at birth, but they believe they happened from abuse. And that's how simply people end up being wrongfully convicted about it. There's a great documentary called The Syndrome on this topic, where they talk to people around the country who've been wrongfully convicted of in baby death cases. They're absolutely right.
You know, one thing that's different about this case than the other two that we've discussed is the result you were able to get. You're able to get it in part because of developments in our understanding of medicine. How often does that happen where, it's a, change in medical understanding or science or technology? I think some of us have a perception that, oh, now we've got DNA testing. It's a magic bullet. It's what, enables us to convict with more certainty and get people off the hook just like that. I think that's a perception that you hear sometimes. So I was just wondering if you can kind of comment on that phenomenon more generally.
Yeah, well, that's partially true. Of course, like lots of things, it's true in the sense that DNA was the most important advancement in, forensic science that we've had in the criminal legal system because of its certainty. But DNA evidence is only as good as the people who collect the evidence, the people who test the evidence, the people who read the results. And DNA evidence is mostly limited to homicide and rape cases, so a small portion of cases. So initially, when DNA came out, we were able to get, a few hundred exonerations. As DNA technology has developed, we've been able to expand it somewhat. I mean, for example, the advent of mitochondrial DNA testing allowed us 10, 15 years ago to start getting people exonerated with hair samples without roots, because we didn't need the cellular part of the root to do the testing. So DNA has been amazing. It is the most certainty. When it's done right, there's nothing more certain than a DNA exoneration, because you can definitively say this sample of DNA is not from that person. And even when you talk about a match, there's no such thing as a 100% match. But basically now the statistics are so high if you have a good solid DNA sample that it's 1 in billions. Actually, it's 1 in basically the population of Earth that's not you. Of course, there's always a possibility you have an evil twin out there committing crimes, but that's basically what's built into the stent. But like you said, the perception is that it gets everything right. It doesn't, because it only applies to a small portion of cases, but it has opened the door for judges and the general public to start accepting other things that could exonerate people, and to start believe there are innocent people in prison. Because before DNA, you could say in every case, like Reuben Hurricane Carter, for example, that to me is a definitive innocence case totally built on race, as made famous with the Bob Dylan song and the Denzel Washington. A huge case, but it wasn't DNA. And there's still people out there who, no, I think he was actually guilty. Even though the case was built on zero and the worst witnesses in history and just purely racist cops setting this guy up. But now that we have documented these 3,400 cases of wrongful conviction, and hundreds and hundreds of them are based on DNA, now you get judges granting hearings to hear about a bad identification or a false confession or something else that might lead to a wrongful conviction. And there's been other developments in sciences. Like now we know a lot more about arson science than we did decades ago. We now know, for example, that fire jumps within houses during an accidental fire, whereas in the past, anytime they saw more than one point of ignition, the arson experts would say, it must be intentional because there's more than one point of ignition. Well, we now know that happens easily during a fire, even though it's still accidental. We've learned that all kinds of science is junk science, like looking at hair samples under microscopes. We know that's really faulty. We know sometimes there's problems with fingerprinting if it's not done right and you don't have good equipment. We know new things about ballistics analysis we didn't know in the past. So there's been a lot of developments, and I'd say every single day something new comes along that, for me, another thing that makes you go, which is exactly what I hear about else. Now that could apply to one of our cases. And then I think of a case I looked at 10 years earlier and think, let's take a look back at that case. Because now based on the sample, like in DNA, when it first came out, you needed a quarter-size sample to do a DNA test. And then all of a sudden one day it was like, wait a minute, we can replicate DNA samples, and now we can do DNA testing on microscopic amounts of DNA. That was a game changer. So we had to go back and look at early cases where they'd come out as inconclusive because they didn't have a big enough sample. And the latest thing is this familial DNA stuff, which is fascinating, where people are sending their DNA samples into 23andMe without knowing that their third cousin was a serial killer. And so there's a lot of cases that are getting looked into based on the fact that our population is basically giving up our DNA to then be put in databases, which as a civil libertarian, I don't love. But as someone who's walked innocent people out of prison, I think maybe we should all be in that data bank, and maybe that would be a better thing.
Well, I'd love to look at all this from a different perspective, and I'd love to hear more about the process for you. How does a case come to you? Do you get letters? You're probably getting letters from prisoners and their families, and
thousands and thousands of letters a year.
Like Miracle of 34th Street, where they had all the letters, for Santa Claus, Is that your office?
That parallel, not that I am Santa Claus, but there's definitely some parallels there. Yeah, I was really naive when I first came to California. I thought, okay, how am I going to get cases? And then LA Times did an editorial, welcome Justin Brooks to California. Just going to get enough people out of prison. And the mail hasn't stopped since then. So
Wow.
you get thousands of letters a year. What I basically did, and as a Michigan person, you'd appreciate this, is that I created a Ford assembly line theory in terms of how to process
Mm-hmm.
them through.
Yeah.
And so the first thing I did is I created a 16-page questionnaire that we send out to everybody who asks for help that gets all the basic information we need to assess a case. Then we get a copy of the appellate briefs that are filed in the case, because we know with the briefs, a lawyer has gone through the transcript and written a summary of the transcript, which in California, which isn't true in Michigan, but in California, lawyers have to write the statement of facts in their brief consistent with the conviction. So there's no real advocacy in it. This is purely like a summary of the trial. In fact, when I first read them, I was out here, I was like, these are terrible briefs. But that's what they do. The good thing as a screening device is I know we can go through that and have a pretty good handle on the case from a 25-page summary. Obviously, if we need to, if we're going to pursue the case, we're going to then read the actual transcript. But it allowed, then I have a law student meet the client in prison, talk to the family members, talk to the lawyers who worked on it in the past, see if there's any physical evidence still exists. We've got like a step-by-step protocol. And then they draft a memorandum on the case. And then twice a week for the last 25 years, I'd have these presentations on cases. And then we decide whether those cases move forward into more serious investigation. To give you a sense of the numbers, if in a typical year we get 2,000 requests, that might become 200 serious investigations. That might lead to 10 to 15 filings a year on habeas petitions. And if we have a good year, we walk 2 or 3 people out of prison. So it's literally 2,000 to 2, 1,000 to 1. And that's the heartbreaking part of the work, is with most of those cases fall by the wayside because we realize we'll never prove that they're innocent. And that's why that number of 3,400 people that have been documented is the tip of the iceberg, because there's many, many more innocent people in prison where we just can't prove it. The evidence doesn't exist. The burden of proof is too high. That's the reality of it.
Also like to ask you about kind of the personal side of all of this for your clients, for the people that you help. I mean, what if you can comment on what it's like for them, how it feels for them? I mean, we imagine them being very joyful, and I'm sure they are, but it's also complicated if you've lost 10, 20 years of your life for a crime you didn't commit. Can you comment on that a little bit? And are they able to put their lives back together?
To varying degrees. I mean, like I talked about earlier, people who went through solitary confinement, everyone doesn't do the same kind of time. Everyone doesn't do the same amount of time. Everyone doesn't have the same familial support going through the process. Sometimes housing, location makes a big difference. Like, for instance, my client, Kimberly Long, was lucky that the women's prison was 15 minutes from her parents' house. And so they were constantly visiting her and she stayed connected to them. My client, Brian Banks, actually, I remember him saying something really profound to me once, which was, he said, going to prison is like dying, where your family will then mourn your death and then they will move on to a certain extent because they carry on with their life. And in your head, they haven't. And that space that you have in that family still exists in your head. And then you get out of prison and you realize it doesn't exist. Like, everybody's moved on. Their lives have all moved on and you haven't. You're stuck. And I think that sums up so beautifully how most of my clients feel. I mean, my client, Mike Hanley, did 36 years in prison. 36 years in prison. He went to prison, he was a guy in his 30s and he gets out, he's 70. It's just, how do you cope with that? He was an auto mechanic when he went to prison. And I remember him looking at a car for the first time when he got out. And he said, this is a computer. I can't work on this. And now he works on classic motorcycles and classic cars. He can't use any technology. He cannot figure the internet out. I've tried to get him into therapy and it was, he lives remotely. So I got him an iPad and it only had like 3 instructions to get on it so he could talk to a therapist, and he just couldn't do it. They all struggle to a certain extent. And then, we have all these inequities when they get out. Like, we fought for 25 years to get a good compensation law in California. And now we have one where they get $150 a day for every day they're wrongfully incarcerated. But 38 states have some form of compensation. All the rest have nothing. And even some of those 38 just have things like free community college, which, isn't necessarily what the client needs. It's something I talk about in the book in terms of our policies. Forget innocent people. Let's talk about guilty people as well. When we build prisons in the middle of nowhere because there's cheap land and cheap labor, what we're really doing is cutting people off from their families. And it's always interesting to me that the people who talk about family values could care less about these families. And the children of people incarcerated haven't done anything wrong. Their families haven't done anything wrong. And a lot of them are poor families. So California, we have a prison in Pelican Bay up on the northern border. Most of the people in it are from Los Angeles. None of my clients' family members have a car or the capacity to drive up there. They can't drive 500 miles to a prison. They can't afford to stay in a motel overnight. They, then have to line up at 5 a.m. to hope they get in. And a lot of them don't even get in when they go for a visit. And we have to think as a country, like, what are we doing? I understand people's sense of wanting to have punishment and be vindictive about stuff. But ultimately, these things just shoot ourselves in the foot. And so my clients come out damaged in the same way other people went to prison, but they have an additional damage. And that's they never should have been there to start with. That's the surrealistic nightmare. Waking up in prison every morning and knowing you're not supposed to be there. When you've committed a bunch of crimes, you can settle into prison and be like, okay, I did it, got caught, I'm going to do my time and get out of here. And so it's a struggle. And with 40 clients who've been freed from prison, I can't even summarize any of their individual issues to you because they're so dramatically different based on so many factors.
Those are amazing insights. Just kind of one question to sort of wrap things up. I don't expect you to have all of the answers, and God knows helping one person at a time is enough. But if there was one thing you could do to improve our criminal justice system in this country, what would it be? If you could wave a magic wand, what would you do?
So it all comes down to resources, right? We don't have unlimited resources. Every time we pour more money into the prison system and into the policing, we cut money somewhere else. We cut schools, we cut something else that would ultimately have long-term better impacts on our society, right? Maybe it's because I'm a law professor, but I still ultimately believe that education is the most important thing to solve most of our problems in society, because the better educated your population is, the better decisions everybody makes, the more we hold people accountable and understand things, and a lot of good comes from that. So I think what we really need to start thinking is just practically about how can we free up resources within the system so that we can do a better job. And that means decreasing prison populations. That means having better trials, more efficiency, making fewer mistakes, and really starting to run this thing like a business, not like something that's just been lobbied to death. There's no area of law that gets more nonsense thrown at it than criminal law, because politicians don't campaign on reforming contract law. They campaign on criminal law. All of them have their opinions. They're totally uninformed opinions on what it should look like. And most of those opinions are just based on what will get them the most votes. So if you look at some of the things California has done, we are now the second largest prison population in the United States. We were number one forever. Texas is now number one. So how did we drop to number two? Well, we legalized marijuana. We reformed our 3 strikes rule so that the third strike, which is what most people thought it had to be violent, but it didn't, because any drug crime also was a third strike. So we had our prison filled with people on drug crimes. And we reformed our felony murder rule to say that unless you're actually seriously involved in the felony and not just the dude outside who had no idea anyone was going to get shot, or even if someone had a gun, we're not going to send those people to prison for the rest of their life anymore. And I think what we have to do is chisel away at every one of these laws, every one of these sentences, because every time we free one person from prison, we're freeing up like 60 grand of money that could be better used. And then we'll start having better processes within the judicial system, because there won't be as many people jammed up in. And that's really what's happened in this country, as I talk about in my book. And that's been a generational change with the war on drugs, with Nixon's war on the inner city, and basically war on hippies and war on people of color. We now ended up with this largest prison system in the world.
It reminds me of that Onion headline from years ago, but drugs declares victory in the war on drugs.
Exactly. We didn't learn the lesson of prohibition. Like, how did we get a lesson that was so dramatic that we had to change the Constitution twice, once to get rid of alcohol, once to bring it back, and learn nothing from that, in that it wasn't effective. We created all the crime families out of prohibition because everyone was making so much money off it. That's why I love, one of my favorite TV shows ever is Boardwalk Empire. I don't know if you've watched it, but the opening scene of Boardwalk Empire is all these mobsters sitting around a table counting down to midnight when alcohol will be illegal, because they all know that's like their golden ticket. Now they're going to all make billions of dollars off selling alcohol illegally. And we didn't learn that at all, any lesson from that. And we repeated the same mistake with drugs. This war on drugs has been ridiculous. So bottom line is we need sensible policies that are pragmatic and not are just focused on being vindictive, responding. And this is Democrats and Republicans, by the way. I'm not talking to any one party here. In fact, every time I hear a Democrat get asked, what would you want to do if your wife was murdered, if your children was murdered? Would you be in favor of the death penalty? I hate the answers. Here's my answer. I would want that person dead. But that's why we don't put people on juries that had their actual loved one involved in the case, right? That's why do I want my government to react how I would after I've just gone through this, the most traumatic thing ever in life? Like, let's just have a little bit of honesty about these things. And then we can be more pragmatic. But when we're just posturing all the time of what's going to be most tenable to our voters, this is where we end up. My problem is I'm involved in like the worst cases. The worst mistakes are made. So I know my vision is a little bit off in terms of that. And that's why sometimes when I wake up late at night and I'm really stressed out, I just have a little mantra where I say, there's more good in the world than bad. There's more good in the world than bad. And I remind myself of that sometimes.
I love it. Well, with that is a perfect thought for us to conclude this interview on. I think that your vision is spot on, and I would commend your book to all of our readers. It really is an incredible read. It's both moving and very important. So appreciate the work that you do and for that book. If listeners want to learn more about you and your work, where can they go?
Sure. Well, first, they can go get my book. You might go to prison even though you're innocent on Amazon.com or at your local booksellers. If you want to hear my daily rants, I'm on every social media platform at Justin O. Brooks on Twitter or X. I'm on Instagram, I'm on Facebook. And if they want to make a donation, theinnocencecenter.org is a great organization to donate to. It's here in San Diego, and all the lawyers worked for me in the past, and I'm on the board there. And we just got a guy out of prison this week, and we continue to do the work.
Congratulations. Okay, we'll put a link to that on the show notes for sure. Well, thanks again. Really appreciate it. Thank you for sharing your insights on the Litigation War Room.
Thank you.
You have been listening to the Litigation War Room with litigation attorney Maxwell Goss. Maxwell Goss brings forceful advocacy and creative solutions to trade secret, IP, and business cases in Michigan and around the country. For show notes and more episodes, please visit us at thelitigationwarroom.com. If you enjoy the show, please be sure to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for listening. The Litigation War Room, including the podcast and all website content and social media, is for informational and entertainment purposes only. This podcast does not provide legal advice and does not give rise to an attorney-client relationship with anyone. All views and opinions expressed on this podcast belong to the guests expressing them and do not reflect the views and opinions of the Litigation War Room.